Hi, I'm Joel. This is a re-recording of a talk I gave recently at CVPR. Um, the talk was a bit different than the other research-oriented keynotes. This talk is about generative AI, but it's also very much about craft, human expression, and how new things are made. It is a critique of the current directions of research, an argument that they are, I believe, significantly misaligned with what I think artists need. And I'm going to propose some new frameworks and ways of thinking about art tools. It's also a personal talk of me trying to understand what I love and hate about generative AI right now. A little bit about me. I'm someone who's been working in traditional mediums like clay and wood, creating lamps and sculptures, and also software, creating genetic algorithms for floor plans and generative corals via open-ended emergent systems. I've also been working with machine learning as an artist, creating custom architectures here for emergent language character sets on the left, using kind of a GAN-like system where you can see the optimization process in AR, and on the right a generative collage project where again you kind of see the optimization process happening as part of the artwork. I'm most known for creating GAN Breeder in 2018. Originally, I was working on breeding floor plans, and I was curious if latent vectors would be a good genetic algorithm representation. Now, GAN Breeder made exploring the latent space of Big GAN fun, for the first time accessible, and also collaborative via this biological metaphor. It was named after the research of Pick Breeder. So every image could be bred, mutated, and have its genes edited. ArtBreeder revealed the vast richness hiding in the latent space of Big N. On the left, you see the images that the model would normally make, and the right, you see the kind of the trending page of the images the community had discovered. We've had over 13 million users and generated hundreds of millions of images. It also emphasized the collective nature of exploration, with all lineages visible and all images in the public domain. And we introduced lots of latent space exploration and editing tools, image uploads, custom user genes or directions, videos, stuff like that. But what I'm most proud of is the artists, some of whom are now well known, who kind of established their AI-based practices on ArtBreeder, using the platform as a source of inspiration and collaboration. Since then, been investigating other metaphors and interfaces and running a small bootstrapped research studio where we've released over the years many tools and experiments, including multiple further tools to navigate the latent spaces of newer diffusion-based models. We've also produced a series of experimental interfaces for craft and control based off metaphors of painting and collage. Here are some early prototypes. On the left is Prose Painter from 2021, which introduced iteratively and spatially applied text to image in a traditional painting interface, and Collager in 2022, which introduced image-to-image controls via collaging noise textures, pre-stable diffusion. I've also been curious to push the limits of control, collaborating with well-known digital artists on more sophisticated painting interfaces that weren't trying to be super accessible, and lean into the full capacity of the models and see what kind of craft was possible. Another direction was exploring if an AI video could ever feel lovingly homemade. Could it have the timeless beauty of traditional crafts as opposed to the short life cycle of new aesthetics? We developed an experimental browser-based puppet theater based on these principles of craft and play. Using puppets now as a metaphor, it uses browser-based hand tracking and paper craft type physics to rig simple forms and compose layered animations. It also has real-time collaboration and focuses on the collective childlike fun of improvising a story rather than the quality of the output. Puppets also established real-time spatial control for generative video composition, supplementing language which inherently cannot express subtle movements. Here I'm actually puppeting IP adapter mask, if you're familiar with vid to vid. So, been working on AI tools for many years now, um, but despite doing so, I've really struggled to appreciate the outputs of most generative AI, what we now refer to as Slop, images that crudely imitate existing styles, and where the outputs of a model more closely resemble each other than the personality of their creators. They fill in underspecified prompts with averageness, which is great for memes, but hard to feel any of the artist in them. And it's great to visualize a Muppets Mad Max, but you won't make the next Muppets. So good for kind of mixing things. Um, and there's an active debate between those who see AI images as soulless slop production and those who find that a kind of Luddite reaction and extol its virtues as the future of creativity. Um, I consider myself a critical optimist, and I don't want to dismiss it as slop, nor blindly hype it, but explore its unmet potential. Recently, I've seen enough slop, sexy dancing ladies, memes. Um, it's fine, but it's not what I care about, and I imagine many folks feel the same way. Unfortunately, it feels like it's been getting worse. Not to pick on Midjourney specifically here, it's true for all the models. Um, Increases in visual fidelity have come at the expense of opportunities for divergent misuse, which are being polished away. Models are staying more closely on distribution to their training data and are increasingly converging their architectures to text-based guidance or text diffusion. The compelling Big N images had hundreds of conditional latent values and often negative ones, negative hamburger, something users hacked in. Our best latent space exploration tools used old school genetic crossover methods on the latents. Collage or an image tools, it's basically hacked in these images during the diffusion process, none of which was intentional. Um, and it seems the most expressive parts of AI models were never intentional, but have always been accidents along the way. Now, of course, there are artists doing amazing things with generative AI, many of whom were at the art gallery at CVPR, but often at the software level, which is inaccessible to most users. So I think when thinking about tools and the limits of what's currently happening, I think it's really important that artists need to be able to create their own styles. As a toolmaker, I'm most excited when I see users create something new and unexpected. I believe a good tool needs the expressive capacity for users to make the outputs their own. Otherwise, it's merely a tech demo or a machine of production. Finding your own voice is one of the most satisfying parts of creating, and it's essential. It's how we express and discover ourselves. Artworks that move us, I believe, are ones where we can feel the personality of the creator coming through. Personally, I see my lamps, my practice, as more than a hobby, but as almost an extension of myself. And I imagine most artists feel the same way. This is what I want my tools to enable for others. And if they cannot do that, I actually don't even see a reason to work on it. In his talk, The Humane Representation of Thought, Brett Victor argues that reducing our interaction with computers to just sitting at a desk and staring at a screen with traditional kind of computer interfaces is wasteful, actually, of the vast human potential for new representations of thought. And it's fundamentally unethical, like keeping a dog caged its entire life. I believe the same applies to creative tools. When we lock artists inside predetermined latent spaces and limit what they can express, we are caging their potential. So what makes a creative tool expressive? The next part of this talk is a bit of thinking through this problem. What makes them expressive? Why was big GANs latent space so much more compelling than style GANs, the ones that use your faces? Why is a scalpel more powerful than a spirograph on the left, which produces very nice but limited patterns that are hard to make your own? When I buy a sculpting tool, for instance, I do not want a face mold with some sliders on it, but that's what a lot of generative AI feels like now. So I think the first part of this argument is that styles are a process. So when artists like Pollock on the left or Calder on the right invented new styles, they were creating new processes. Pollock developed his own dripping technique using custom tools, hardened brushes, wooden sticks, syringes, with specific paint viscosities. His aesthetic emerged from the physics of paint flow and his body movements. Calder applied his mechanical engineering background to create a very custom process. He started in pencil and paper for sketching and moved to wire for 3D sketching. He cut shapes from sheet metal using specialized shears, painted elements with his signature colors, and assembled everything with precise wire connections. He designed multiple custom tools for wire straightening, studio pulley systems, and a custom center of gravity device for calculating balance points. Certainly, the ideas and influences behind an artist's idea are socially and culturally informed, but the ability to express those ideas physically comes about by creating custom processes or their practice. Even conceptual artists like Sol LeWitt, who did not physically create works themselves, still defined a process that was their style. When we make a mistake in generative AI, like reducing a style to just a latent embedding, is a technical term, a point in a latent space, it misses an important nature of what a style is and how we create new ones. In the 1956 French documentary, The Mystery of Picasso, we see a time lapse of him painting. In it, the forms evolve from a flower to a fish to a chicken to a face as it transforms from a sketch to a painting. Perhaps Picasso is being cheeky here for the video, but I think this video actually illuminates some deeper clues to the nature of creating. Specifically, the next part of the argument, that artworks are the result of a given process, a malleable process specifically. And I think anyone who works in a medium, specifically like clay or paint, this is pretty obvious. The fun is not knowing what you will create, but to surprise yourself during the process. So to think a little bit more process, here's like a diagram of what I would say was Picasso's process. Over time, there's many decisions available to him, and he went through different tools. I think this is really fundamentally different from what we do when we're prompting, which is much more of like an iterative search, or I would say like a querying. And there's a really fundamental difference between these two. You may ask, why could you not have this kind of process with generative AI? And so multiple decisions are made through the process of creating a single artifact, through which it increases in complexity, it goes to different forms of representation using different tools. And the process on the right, you get the final output and you iterate on the inputs. That is a process to a degree, but you're still limited to the given manifold you started on, or kind of what are the models, the single models you're able to create in a single step. Accordingly, and tellingly, courts in Europe recently stated that no amount of work on a single prompt is sufficient for the output to deserve copyright. So the kinds of steps, decisions you make through the process matter. So to explore this further, I want to talk about cellular automata. And so this emphasis on process brings me to computation and emergence in virtual life, where my journey began. So Conway's Game of Life is a 2D cellular automata where cells on a grid live or die based off simple neighbor counting rules. Despite its simplicity, it produces remarkably complex and beautiful emergent patterns and behaviors. Artistic creation, I'm going to argue, is kind of like cellular automata, a step-by-step emergent unfolding where each step depends on the previous step and cannot be predicted or shortcut. Each creative move, if you want to call it that, like a single brushstroke from Picasso, compounds in an unpredictable way. Of course, here it's the creator driving each step, but it's this kind of emergent unfolding where each step depends on the previous one to give kind of this emergent complexity. Now, relatedly, the polymath Stephen Wolfram introduces concept of computational irreducibility, specifically with cellular automata, in his book, A New Kind of Science. The principle of computational irreducibility says that the only way to determine the answer to a non-simple question or simulation is to perform the full steps of computation. For instance, in this case, a one-dimensional cellular automata, here going from top to bottom with the rules at the top, it unfolds in an unpredictable way that it cannot be shortcut. You cannot jump from the first step at the top to the last one to the bottom. There are no shortcuts, and I claim the Picasso painting also had no shortcuts. To go on a further philosophical detour, the architect and philosopher Christopher Alexander, known for books like A Pattern Language, expands on this specific insight with a coherent metaphysics in his series The Nature of Order, in which he describes a kind of universal process of sequential transformations that give rise to the forms of cities and those found in biology. And the way to understand a city or a biological form is by its development, the process that created it. And he blames, actually, philosophers like Descartes for introducing this thing he calls the mechanistic perspective in Western thought. The mechanistic perspective states that you can understand something like a clock by decomposing it into its modular and interchangeable parts. Here's springs or gears. And to understand something, you take it apart and you put it back together. However, Alexander argues you cannot build a tree out of leaves. Most objects cannot be understood mechanistically, but through the emergent process of transformations. Now, to tie these ideas together, my argument today about what is wrong is that the process of creating something new is much like the essential process Alexander describes. So here we have the growth of an embryo, a one-dimensional cellular automata from left to right, and the painting process also all going from left to right. And all of which I believe are these computational, irreducible sequences of transformations that give rise to forms. In the painting, the human is the central element, the iterative loop of perceiving and transforming powered by tools that is the generative process, analogous to the biological expression at the top or the cellular automata rules in the middle. And in all cases, these are developments of a form that have to happen through these iterative, sequentially applied transformations, and there's no way to jump from the beginning to the output. Very similar to an artistic process, you have to go through the process of discovery and transformation in your medium. However, no generative AI actually allows these processes of discovery throughout the creation of a single artifact. All of our generative models are a reflection of a mechanistic perspective, a mapping of inputs to outputs determined by the machine. These are all bad, and they're all based on the assumption that images can be represented by a mixture of distinct and interchangeable parts, such as a style embedding or style reference, and that style can exist in some kind of embedding space. And the convergence of all the generative AI interfaces reflect this as well. They're basically everyone on the market is a prompt box with some inputs like style reference, which I think is a manifestation of this X to Y ideology: text to image, image to video, text to SVG, etc. And I think this is one of the fundamental assumptions that leads to Slop. No amount of additional control will change this, which is a big deal. I used to think we needed more inputs, right? More controls, and that would make it better for artists. However, I think now that's not actually the case. No amount of additional control will change this and allow open-ended exploratory creation for users. Fundamentally, this is a distinction between top-down interpolation and bottom-up generative emergence. For those more deeply in the field, you may be wondering about tools such as Comfy UI, which allow kind of a graph of operations. Ultimately, I think this goes to the same problem. You can string together multiple X to Y transformations, but that's different than an emergent process with a human in the loop during the creation. And each one is what you might call a agency losing transformation. And that's why the outputs of these tools still very much look like Slop. I think this marketing slogan also captures the problem well. It sounds really great, right? Who wouldn't want to help people turn their ideas into reality? Unfortunately, I now believe if your goal is to make tools for artists, this is deeply flawed. Bad. So let's dig into this a little more. Why? For one, prompting can only express what has already been defined. Pollock's painting style or Cowder's mobiles did not have names for them before they were created and could only have been created the way they were by a custom new process that was created by a combination of simple tools, in many cases user-generated tools. Novel works unfold through a creative process and are not a priori articulable. Artworks often begin with vague intuitions and get resolved along the journey. Process is not something to be optimized away, but is a liberating way of nonverbal thinking. When I learn woodworking, I learn new ways of thinking in the language of the medium, which allows me to produce new ideas, because I can now think in terms of things like joints. And then I can think about how to make new types of tables and chairs because of that. And I think anyone who really enjoys creating in any medium, watercolor, clay, etc., it's that surprising yourself through the journey and not knowing what you will make that is so fun and satisfying. And and that's what gives it the ability to make it your own, is that kind of accumulation of decisions that compound. So what does this mean for research? Um, I think if we want better, more humane tools, we need to stop optimizing for visual fidelity and prompt adherence and reframe the research questions from optimizing content generators to instead creating new open-ended materials and tools that are simple, malleable, and composable. This will allow human-in-the-loop creative emergence craft via custom user processes. So what does, the scalpel or chisel of a Gaussian splatting look like? What is the paintbrush of a pixel VAE latent? What is the tool that allows users to make these tools look like? Now, these are not just questions of how to use our current models. I think they actually require new models based off these ideas. There are other interesting questions, like how do we evaluate and create rich latent spaces that are vast and worth exploring? I don't think we have the words for how to describe a good latent space. Now, I'm not claiming I have all the answers or even the right questions. My goal with this talk is to encourage more research and help articulate the problem. I think there are many more researchers who would work on this than there are currently because the problem has not been well defined. Now, there are many different directions based off some of the principles here. Like, for instance, how could users sculpt their own loss functions? One early prototype of something we've been working on based off these ideas is a traditional painting app where everything is malleable. And so here are a bunch of user-generated brushes. You could prompt for your own brush or to edit a current brush. Each one is a kind of WebGL shader, so it's very expressive and powerful transformations that they can do. And more importantly, the entire rendering pipeline is itself malleable. So here I've prompted for a node, it's on a graph editor, where I can control the color value with my finger. And now I move my finger to control the color while painting this custom generated brush. And this is the early exploration in how we could have kind of users create their own tools and processes. And it's very early and exploratory, but you can see by kind of iteratively applying and compounding these different user prompted brushes, we get something very unique. That doesn't exist in the distribution of any model. It's not Slop, whatever you want to say about it. And this is an early prototype of what might ways to incorporate generative AI in ways that can enable kind of user-made tools. So to kind of conclude, Um, I'll never forget the email I got from someone in the hospital who said they were able to breed images with one hand all day and what it meant for them, the one hand they had available. Um, or the number of folks who told me they were able to feel like artists for the first time. So that's why I think this is really important. And I think the research done at conferences like CVPR are upstream of the tools that will be made, which are upstream of future visual culture. And so I think there are future mediums waiting to be created, and the people who can make that happen are at conferences like CVPR. So we must align research with what is good for people, and that means dispelling these ideas that image quality and prompt adherence are most important for artists. Artists need simple, modular, and malleable tools to create their own processes and develop their own practices in craft. This is the path to living art, with an emotional connection between the work, its creator, and the audience. Each new medium enables many new artists. So let's leave the restrictive, inhumane, mechanistic prompt boxes behind for open-ended, malleable creative mediums. Future artists depend on you. Thank you very much.